Okay, the broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning. Welcome to November's Exago Support Lab. This month, we're going to flip the script and do the technical lab at the start of the month. And then at the end of the month, we're going to be doing some non-technical topics, and I'll talk about those later on. My name's Travis. I just want to make sure everyone signed in can hear me. So in the right-hand panel of your screen, you'll see a questions box. If you could take a moment and just type a yes or a thumbs up to let me and my team know that everything's coming through all right. All right, great. We see some questions coming in. Perfect. So during the presentation, if you do have any questions, if you want to see an example or more detail on something, use that questions box to ask the question as it comes into mind. We like getting questions. If it's not related to the topic we're talking about at the moment, we'll answer it either at the end, or it could be content for a future lab. So with that, I want to dive right in, and this lab will be a little technical. We're not going to go into code, but we will show a little bit of XML and talk about some database concepts. So today what we're going to talk about are vertical tables and multiple data models. And really, the aim here is to talk about a couple of ways Exago can support complex data setups. So the first one we're going to talk about is vertical tables. And vertical tables are used often when you want to collect data, but you're not sure exactly what properties you want to collect. So an example could be if you have a HR database or a sales database or something along those lines, and for employees or staff, you want to collect some additional properties of those staff. But that list of properties you want to collect may evolve and change over time. So for example, here you have a traditional database where a table might have something like the employee ID and then a column for each particular property you want to capture. So, what special skills do they have? Maybe they have some stock options or not. Do they work remotely? How tall are they? Whatever you want to capture here, you have a column for each property. And this works great in many situations. But if you, say, want to add properties that you're capturing over time, the issue from a technical perspective is that you have to go back and add to your database. You have to add columns, and you have to adjust ways that data is entered into databases. And that can be a big development. So often, you may structure this same set of data instead of having these broken out as separate columns. You might structure it something more like this. And here we're setting it up so that we have a set of columns across the top that isn't going to change. And part of that column, you can indicate what field or property you want to capture, as well as the value of that property. So here, if we wanted to say add an additional property for an employee, we wouldn't have to change the underlying database structure. We would simply add a new row and capture that for the corresponding employee. So this is how it's set up on the database, right? And this is a common setup you see whenever you may want to, add columns dynamically, or even potentially let users add additional columns to the data set. So the question is, how do we do this in Exago? So the key for making this work in Exago is that we have 4 columns. We have a key, a name, a value, and a data type. We can have some other columns, but we have at least those 4, and I'll go back and we'll show that here. So the key field, this is going to indicate the corresponding row. The field name, of course, is analogous to the label of the field of the value is the actual value for that particular row and field. And the data type is going to indicate, is this text, is this a number, is this a Boolean value, etc. In this case, we may want to link that to an employee, so we have an additional column here. Now, Exago can take these 4 columns and any additional columns, and it can be set to transform the data from the vertical table structure to something that looks more like a traditional table. And the nice part is this can all be set up directly by the administrator. so that from an end user perspective, they don't realize they're using a different type of data structure. They just see, the data objects and entities as they would expect them to appear, as though they were any other table or type of data object. So to do this, though, the one thing I'll mention is that we're going to not use the admin console, but instead, these changes would be made directly to Exago's configuration file. Now, inside of the Exago installation, there's a config file that's generated by the admin console, but as it's XML, you can maintain and update that dynamically. And we can show this in a live example in just a moment. But to first, what I want to do is show what kind of XML we would have to add to the config file. Now, I should mention that I'm showing an example here. There's a great example in our Knowledge Center, so if you want to try this out on your own after the lab, there is an example that walks you through, so you don't have to, guesswork or see this recording and go through as well. So the XML to define data objects, and here we're calling them entities. The first part of it is the same as any other data object built in the admin console. So it has a name, an alias, and a database name. It points to the data source and the type of object, as well as what column is the unique key. But down here we've highlighted there's some additional code to tell Exago, hey, this is a vertical table, and we're going to transform it. Now, when we transform it, what we have to know is, well, what column in the database indicates the name of the field or the name of the columns once we do the transform. So in this case, we named that column field name. And what column in the database holds the value? In this case, we kept it simple. We named that value. And what column in the database holds the data type? From there, we can add any other columns that we don't want to transform. So for example, here, we're keeping employee ID just as it is. Now, what I want to do is show what this looks like. So here, I'm going to jump over to our database. And inside of our database, we've already built this table. And you'll see this looks just like we showed. We have our key column, our field name column, our values, our data type, and our employee IDs. And then what we can do is inside of the Exago installation, there's the config file. There are XML files, so we can add that XML. I've already done that here, so I won't go through that step, but we can add the XML directly to our configuration. And then if we come into our full Exago UI, when we open our Express View or Advanced Report or any other type of report, inside of our data, we'll see the data object we've added, and instead of seeing a column for field name, key, value, data type, we'll see this transform is already done for us dynamically. So I want to pause there and see if there are any questions. Okay, great. I don't see any questions coming in, so we'll move over to our second topic here. And for that, we're going to look at multiple data models. So with vertical tables, we looked at a single data object. Multiple data models is going to let us look at some dynamic ways we can think about the relationship between multiple data objects. And specifically, within a database, there might be two or more data objects that have multiple ways that they can be related. And to give you a concrete example, you can imagine at a school or a university, you can have professors and students, and there are multiple ways professors and students can relate to each other. The two we're going to look at is a professor can be the student's direct advisor, so they have a direct relationship, or a professor can teach a class and that student can be enrolled in that class, so they have an indirect relationship. Now, normally, Exago will allow you to have weights on a join, so if you always want one of these two relationships to be the way Exago relates these objects in the data source, you can simply set a weight. I'll show you that in a little bit. and utilize that. But let's say you have very savvy users, or you have reports that require deciding between those two types of relationships. We're going to show a way that you can give the user options of how to relate these objects. So in the database, this is going to look something like this. In the advising case, the professor table is going to relate directly to students. But in the enrollment, you're going to go from professors teaching classes to a middle table for enrollment, and then the students are going to join that way. So you have this direct path here, but you also have an indirect path through classes and enrollment. Now what we want to do is set Exago to handle both of these cases. So how do we do this? Well, first we're going to create all the data objects in the admin console. Then we're going to create all the joins in the admin console. And now, once we do that, between those two models of data and relational paths. So we're going to create directly, again, in the configuration XML, something we call categories. Certain categories. So I'll show you the XML first, and then we'll go over to the admin console and talk about which parts need to be set. So in the XML, there are going to be three things we need to do. The first is we're going to define categories. And categories is a little bit of an overloaded term, but we're just thinking of these as folders or data objects. And a category has two properties. It has an ID. This is the way we link them up to joins and data objects. And it has a name. So this is what's going to be displayed in the UI of Exago to the end user. And you'll notice here that we have slashes. These are going to help us work for subfolders here. The data object itself, again, in the XML, we're calling these entities, but these are data objects. Inside of that, we have a property called category. Now we can in the admin console, but for consistency, I'm showing it here as well. And here, we're going to add the ID of any categories we want this data object to live inside of. Now, we can use a comma and list as many categories as we want, or just one. Then within a join, again, we have a category property, and again, we can list the ID of the category that we want to have this join work inside of. And now the key here is that if we have the same objects inside of multiple categories, having the join property set here within the property category within a join set will let Exago know when a user selects a data object from a specific category to use that specific join or set of joins. Now, that looks a little complex, so let me show you from an end user perspective what this will look like. So again, within the, I'm going to go into build an advanced report actually to show this easiest. Report. And within the categories tab, or the data object tab of Exago, we're going to look at the Exago University. This is our category, the folder that the data objects reside inside of. And we have subfolders here. So really, we're going to focus on these two subfolders. And what we'll notice is two things. One, some of the objects are listed in both categories. And if I, for example, say select professors from the advisor model category, what you'll notice is that professors now joins directly to classes and students. And the way it's joined here will be directly by advisor. But if I select professors from our student model, it will only let us join to classes or enrollment if we've created those joins in our system. So in this way, we can give users the understanding of, this is how these objects are going to relate if you choose it from this folder and from a different folder. So these category names can be very informative to the user. So I want to pause there as well and see if there are any questions. Great. So just as a brief recap, what we did was what we talked about today was we looked at the vertical tables. So when you have a data set that you may want to add columns to over time, you can instead define a static object in your database, but let Exago handle transforming it into something easier for the end user here. And then we looked at the multiple data models, where you can have multiple ways of relating to data objects, and you can give the user the choice as they build a report, which of those relationships do they want to use as they build the report, and behind the scenes Exago will join them differently and you'll get the appropriate results. So today's lab, because we've moved pretty quickly through it, is going to be a little shorter. But with that, I want to pause for questions. And as folks type in any questions they may have, I do want to alert you of some upcoming support labs. So we have 3 left before the end of the year. On the 22nd, my colleague Emma is going to be demonstrating our 17.2 release, our upcoming release, the new dashboard experience. On the 6th of December, my colleague Nick is going to be talking about how an end user feature where you can display reports even if no data qualifies. And it's going to be a couple of features and wrap some things nicely together around dashboards, formulas, conditional formatting, some of the things that we covered earlier this year. And then on the 13th, I will be presenting the JavaScript API. Last month, we presented the .NET and REST-based API. So at the end of the year here, we're going to be presenting our latest API, a new way of launching Exago into a div or container on the page. So with that, I'm just going to pause and see if any questions have come in here. Great. So no questions came in, but some very nice compliments on the info. I do want to reiterate for both of these topics, the multiple data models and the vertical tables, there are great articles on our Knowledge Center. So if you go to exagosupport.com, there's a search and you can search vertical table or multiple data model. Both come with examples very akin to the ones we've shown here. So if you want to give this a try on your own, in your own environment of Exago, I certainly encourage you to do so. And of course, all of our webinars are recorded and available there so you can see them as well. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much for attending today. If you do have any feedback, suggestions, or ideas for future labs, we're always looking to hear from them. So after the webinar closes here, you'll receive a brief survey. I do really appreciate if you fill that out. And with that, happy reporting.